thank you everybody for joining us tonight, or whatever time it is when you're listening to our recording. This is the MiSTer stage event tonight, or today. We have Ace. How are you doing, Ace?
Doing well.
And we have Blackwine.
Yeah, hey.
Of course, some of the listeners already know who you are, but some won't. So could you please introduce yourself, Blackwine?
Yeah, I go by nickname Blackwine. This is a handle I came up with in Demoscene sometime in 90s. And, the latter part comes from my surname, and the other part, I don't know. Maybe I thought it was cool, or maybe I wanted it to be something unique. That's it.
Awesome. And of course, we'll be talking about your work. We'll get started with that in a minute. And how about you, Ace?
So, for those who don't know, I got my start with, mostly console modding, just getting into the basics as a teen. Then from there, it just kind of steamrolled into just diverging everywhere with analog audio in particular, with the Genesis. Put together the Mega Amp in 2014, updated in 2017, looking to get that updated again. And a couple of years in 2018, when Smoke Monster started to promote MiSTer, got wind of it, and I already was looking for an FPGA platform to develop on after having tinkered with a one-chip MSX around 2013. And MiSTer just ended up being the platform I was looking for, and I've been developing for it ever since.
Yeah, I can imagine how it attracted you. And of course, we'll go in a bit more detail into your backstories. And but we can get started on how you got into games in general, Ace.
Well, I got my start on the Nintendo 64, actually, in the late 90s. But at the time as well, I had... my father still had his NES from 1985, so ended up playing on that. Had the Nintendo 64, got a GameCube in 2001 after having been literally floored by Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, having played the demo. That instantly sold me on the system. Then, oddly enough, I ended up getting a PlayStation 2 in 2004, I believe, maybe 2005, I don't remember the exact year, but it was specifically due to Sega Rally 2006, which, much to my dismay, never actually left Japan. So, a bit of a waster of that, but it did kind of get me more into the console modding side. Then it just spiraled from there. Ended up collecting, starting with Sega, then ended up expanding to more Nintendo hardware, Sega, Sony, Microsoft, you name it.
Yeah. So this is great because I believe that profile of going back to older stuff is quite interesting. I'll get to more questions on that in a minute. And what about you, Blackwine? How did you get started into gaming in general, or hacking or coding?
I was exposed to computers and arcade games as a youngster. I can't remember exactly the age and what happened first, but I remember that before getting hands on my first computer, I used to read magazines from first to last page, and I loved the articles about games, about computer graphics. And the thing that hooked me the most was the page with little basic programs. So I learned some basics about programming from them. And then my father bought an 8-bit Atari computer. It was 800 XL model. It was in 1987, as far as I remember. And we had it connected to black and white TV and no sound because we used Secam where I live, and but even without sound and with black and white display, it was like magic.
I can only imagine. And I guess that you started programming there.
Yeah. Basic was the thing you got when you turn on your computer. So it was just 3 seconds and you could start programming.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike with modern computers, they have to boot a little bit longer.
And also you'd have to install the SDK and figure out the stuff elsewhere.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you had it from as new, but these computers, when you bought them, I love the fact that they came with manuals that detailed everything.
Yeah, sure.
Did you use any particular storage mediums or remember playing some games there, or were you more into the coding side from them?
I started with cassettes, and the 2 games I remember the most was Pole Position and Montezuma's Revenge. That was the finest game.
Nice. And yeah.
No, not really.
I was going to ask you what came from there. What happened then? What followed? Platforms? Do you remember any in particular?
Yeah. Sure. The next platform I got into was an Amiga. I was visiting my friend, and I remember I wanted to buy a synthesizer back then to play some music or some stuff like that. But when I heard the sound of an Amiga, I changed my mind, and the only thing I wanted back then was to get that computer. So yes, that was I think the most important computer in my history, because it was my teen years, and I spent a lot of time with it and learned M68K assembly and all these custom registers. The whole design of this computer was something really that stood out.
Yeah, in particular in sound. Could you tell us about that a bit? What is it about? What made it different?
Yeah, most computers, like all 8-bit computers and the early 16-bit computers back then made the cheap sound, and with Amiga it was different because it was PCM sound with 4 channels. So basically you could play anything you wanted. Of course, it didn't have the fidelity. It was 8-bit PCM, and you could play up to 28 kilohertz. But nonetheless, back then it was something special.
And you had the 1 megabyte floppies, right? Well, 60, 77 and 20. It was
it was 880.
It was okay.
It was something
custom.
Yes, custom. But with some tweaking, you could squeeze out 1 megabyte. Yeah, if you.
Yeah, I kind of remember that. I remember listening to Bat Dance on an Amiga as a demo. From the Batman movie, right?
Right.
And Ace, how did you get it to? Because you started in the Nintendo 64, and of course you were exposed to the NES. But how did you went retro in a way? What pushed you that way, and what was the path that you took?
It was mainly 2 things. The first one was I was starting to get dissatisfied with the games that were coming out from modern hardware at the time, circa 2006, 2007 onwards. And at the time, I started to pick up a couple of older games on the Virtual Console. And that was when I really started to notice that software emulation, especially back then, was not really able to properly reproduce the experience, especially with the audio. Because the first thing I noticed was playing Gradius. A lot of the sounds were pretty horribly aliased. And when I ended up with an original cartridge to use on the NES, that was when it became immediately apparent that something wasn't right. So it was at that point that I then started to pick up a bunch of older hardware that I personally had never been exposed to, never played, even older than I am. Mostly thanks to a family friend who had a pawn shop. He might still have it now, I'm not really sure. But back then I'd get a lot of hardware on the cheap thanks to him.
I can't imagine. And you specialized in not specialized, but you've put a lot of attention on the Genesis hardware, right?
Yes.
Which is contemporaneous to the Amiga, and a very different beast in that sense. What dropped you that path? Same things, or was something specific after that?
No, I think it was more so because that was when I was really starting to get an interest into actually figuring out or learning how circuits are put together, especially on the analog side, because it was the Crystal Clear audio mod at the time, which I thought back then was very complex and gave an end result that wasn't really to my liking, on top of being specifically created for the YM3438, which was used in later hardware revisions, except for two specific Genesis Model 2 boards. So that was where the Mega Amp actually first began. It started out in 2012, targeting first the YM2612 only. But then I ended up having a colleague on Sega 16 come in who suggested to expand the circuit to cover everything. So not just the YM2612, but even the integrated ones used with later Yamaha chipsets, as well as the GOACs, the 315-5960 and 315-6123, found in the VA4 Genesis Model 2 and both revisions of the Genesis 3.
Yeah, and this is interesting. Maybe some of the audience are lost between all these things. The Yamaha chips, instead of the PCM that Blackwine described on the Amiga, or on top of, or on par with, use frequency modulation as synthesis. And Sega built this. Well, Sega had Yamaha build this custom version of the FM family chip, and they changed revisions during the life of the console, probably due to costs.
Most likely.
And yeah, most likely. And they changed all the audio hardware, right? All the analog stage of the hardware.
Not just the analog side, but even the digital side. And I would say it's mostly due to potentially a manufacturing process mismatch, because the chips that Yamaha made for later revisions were actually using CMOS fabrication, but the YM2612 was actually not based off of that. I think it was NMOS, but I could be wrong. It's something completely different, but there was already the YM3438, which was directly compatible, being as it's a CMOS chip, but still able to run or accept the same commands as a YM2612. The difference is the digital to analog conversion circuit in the chip is very different. So overall, the YM2612, you could probably characterize its sound as being fairly dirty in a way because of the ladder effect, which, especially with fade-ins and fade-outs or just low-volume instruments in general, those typically tend to get blown out to where it almost sounds like a sort of reverb effect. And several games do take advantage of this, but there are a couple, and the main one that I will cite is Afterburner 2, which the ladder effect is critical to the game sounding right, because without that, the background notes are completely lost.
And could you briefly explain what the ladder effect is to our audience that is not familiarized with that, and why these chips have an integrated digital to analog stage instead of having it separate?
Well, the integration is mostly for, I'd say, cost cutting, because if you look at the YM2151, which is what most arcade boards back then were using, including Sega's own System 16 board, having those two separated would constitute for a more expensive setup. So putting it all together would make it simpler. The thing with the ladder effect is, it was, as I mentioned, that in terms of what you hear coming out of the chip, you get this very different balancing, especially between audio channels of lower volume. So if you have something that's very quiet, it tends to get made louder overall. So it's almost like, I guess you could say, a very non-linear volume scale from the most quiet to the loudest instrument, or volume levels, I should say.
Yeah.
So in general, if games do take advantage of that, they tend to sound more, I guess you could qualify it as more dry on the YM2612, or YM3438 rather, because its digital to analog converter has been completely redone. It doesn't sound the same, or mostly the same, but anything that makes use of the ladder effect will either be very subdued or completely lost.
Yes, and you have to select the family and based on the system, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah, it changed between eras.
Yeah, except for that one period of the VA2 and VA2.3 Genesis Model 2, I guess to potentially strong-arm Yamaha into reducing the cost of their chips, the main ICs, the custom parts, were manufactured instead by Toshiba for those two, and rather than have a YM3438 integrated in the chip, an external YM2612 was used in its place. So you end up with this sort of weird, in a sense, almost like condensed Genesis Model 1, because some of the weird quirks that affected the Model 1s prior to the VA7 revision carry over to these two, although there is one specific chip which is most commonly found in the VA2.3 board, that being the 315 5685. That one has some video effects that don't work properly. So those ones are a bit more bugged than a typical Genesis Model 1. And you also get some of the weirdness with Hellfire and Earthworm Jim, where Hellfire sounds correct because there is a flag known as FM Busy, which can only be accessed from one address on the Genesis Model 1, except for VA7. It's the same case on these particular Model 2s. Now, the thing with Hellfire is it actually expects this flag to only be accessible from that one address. And what happens is on every other revision, barring those two those two Genesis Model 2s and most Model 1s, the music will actually run slower. Whereas with Earthworm Jim, it's the opposite case, where it actually attempts to read from one of those extra addresses to get the FM Busy status. And on Model 2s, with the exception of those V2.3s, it'll sound correct, but on a Model 1, you will notice that the music hesitates a bit.
Yeah, it's a lot of information to take in, for which you've been studying for years. I'm sure we'll get back to this, because there's the analog filters, there's the differences.
Oh man, yeah.
There's so much information here, but I'd like to contrast what we have right now on the Amiga side and what Blackwine experimented here, because there he had the Paula chip, right?
Yes.
And back in the 90s, when you were playing with a real Amiga, did you started playing with synthesizers, since this was your main attraction to the system?
I didn't use synthesizers, but there is a software called Soundtracker or ProTracker, and I was into this. So it allowed you to sample, to create your own sounds with a sampler, and do whatever you would wish. Use any instruments, something that sounded like real instruments, but when you listen to it these days, it may sound aliased and not perfect, but back then it was something out of this world. And yes, I was into ProTracker scene. I produced some modes. Not too often these days, but last year I released one tune, so I do it even these days.
Yeah, and you have very different tools right now. right?
Yeah, especially the quality of samples, because these samplers from the past was really, not really good quality.
Yeah, but it gave them character in some sense, right? As well.
Yeah. Some unique sounds. Yes.
And back then, you mentioned that you created the samples. Were you using just digital means to synthesize them inside the Amiga, or were you recording from real life sources?
Yeah, rather recording or sampling from cassettes.
A microphone. From cassettes. Okay.
From cassettes, or sometimes just ripping or borrowing from some other mods.
Yeah, you could rip from games or demos, right?
Yes, that's true. There was ST01, from the disc from original Sound Tracker that contained some samples that everyone used. So yeah, that was also a source. Yeah.
And now that you mentioned that, back then, were you releasing the mods or?
Yeah, I released some mods. Some of them was included in some executable releases. A demo called Infliction, I think, and the other one was included in some crack throw to the Dino Blaster.
Could you tell them what that means? Because maybe some in the audience,
right? Or
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that was amazing, but probably many don't didn't leave then. Because I'd like to ask you more about that, but please explain that to them.
Yeah. So back in a day, with on Amiga, all games were released on floppies and contained some protection, and there were cracking groups who cracked this protection and released unprotected versions, maybe included some trainer with it, and this was some tiny executables with music, possibly a group logo, scroll text, and yeah, it was it, I think.
It was a very different world, right? Because you mentioned trainers right now, and I bet some in the audience don't know what trainers are either.
Yes. No, they allow you to enable some cheats in games like invisibility or unlimited unlimited lives maybe.
But what was amazing about this is that you booted the floppy and you got music playing that was usually awesome, and some raster effect or fonts that were impressive in their use of colors, and it showed the name of the group that did the tracker or the crack, and then you'd boot into the game, right?
Yes, that's right.
And so yeah, please go
on. Not really. I just wanted to say that this movement evolved later to something that is now a demo scene, but this is another topic. I'm not sure.
We'll get into it because it's really interesting.
Okay.
After all, this is the meat of talking with you guys, talking about these experiences and sharing what maybe some of the people that are using the MiSTer or playing them whatever way, even in original hardware or running this, they can understand what these mean and what they are and what's the context, what was culturally happening. How did you swap this, or how did you get access to these floppies with these demos or trainers or Of course, people today imagine that they just go into IRC, right, or whatever. But what was the method back then?
It was easy for us where I'm living because we had actually no copyright laws until '94, I think. So there were a lot of little shops here. They just copied anything for you for some not a great sum. So it just looked like this, and yeah, and it's, well, I don't know.
But back then, you could just buy floppies about anywhere, right?
Yeah,
that was also quite different.
Yes, that's right.
And the quality in the floppies was very different from what we got like 10 years later.
Yeah.
Right? They usually lasted longer, were built in a better way back in the early 90s or 80s.
Yeah, that's true.
And did you get any experience with the FM capabilities of the Amiga? Because you could kind of do some tremolo or vibrato, right? With modulating one PCM wave with the other?
Well, FM sound, you can do FM sound or something like that sounds like a chip tune by doing short samples and doing some effects like said vibrato or arpeggio, where you switch notes very fast, like every frame. To make some chords or something like that, yeah.
And speaking about all this, Ace, have you ever gotten into Amiga in any way?
Not really. I mean, I do have an Amiga 500, but I don't really use it much, mostly due to a lack of the appropriate video cables. But at the same time, and this is probably going to make some people, I guess, hate me, because I've never been too fond of the Amiga's sound, personally.
It's its own thing, and as Blackwine was saying, it was very different when we were back in the day. I didn't own an Amiga, but my cousin had an Amiga, and I owned the Genesis, so you can imagine that rivalry back then.
Yeah, my thing though with the Amiga, the thing that I really don't like is the way that the stereo panning is done, being that you have only 4 channels, but they each get hard panned to one side, so it really limits what you can do, and to me, it's a sound that's really not pleasing, mostly.
Yeah, especially when you use headphones.
Especially with headphones.
Yeah, on speakers it's quite different because you get this mix-up between channels due to the position, and it's something that most people don't understand about the difference using headphones, and you have some crossover between the left signal and the right signal when you use speakers, and that's why it feels more natural, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you do get that sort of... It's almost like you get a center mix between the stereo channels, but you do still hear where they're coming from. So if you have something that's louder on the right side, you'll hear it from there, but it will still get mixed in somewhat with what you have on the left side. But if you're wearing headphones, you lose that because the sound is going straight to your ears.
Yeah. There's some headphone amplifiers that can do crossover for you in the analog domain, right?
That I'm not sure of.
Yeah, I've seen them. It's pleasant. Of course, I've not measured them, but it's pleasant. And have you ever gone into the low-pass filters and that kind of thing on the Amiga Blackwine? And how it's filtered?
The filter on Amiga is real simple. You can just turn it on and off. You can see the LED, the power LED, is connected to it. When it's bright, the filter is on. I remember doing some assembly code to fade from the fade the filter by doing some fast switching, the PWM method with it. So you certainly can do it, but it uses a lot of CPU, so it's not really suitable for demos or games. But you can do it.
For a trainer or for that would be amazing, right? It would work fine.
Yeah.
When you have the CPU free, and what kind of Amiga did you have back then?
Yeah, the first Amiga was Amiga 500. It was 91, I think. And then a few years later, I got my Amiga 1200, which I own to this day. And yeah, it's convenient because it's got the hard drive, and you can use compact flash medium these days. So it's really quiet and fast, and you can have all the games and software on it. Yeah.
It felt like the future, right? Back in the time. It's something that I usually mention, that what we regard as limitations nowadays were not. They were freedoms back in the day, because you didn't have that capability before. And it opened so many doors, right? It felt different. And I believe that the floppy disk storage medium helped a lot in the Amiga, because you had so much space and it was cheap. And then you moved on to, well, not moved on, but you've also worked on Game Boy. What was your first contact with the Game Boy?
Oh, well, I didn't. Of course, I did play some games from friends had Game Boy in 90s, but I didn't own one back then. I think I've got my first Game Boy in 2018, I think 2018, and I wanted to do something different from compared to things I did in the past, and I wanted to learn Z80, and also the reason was that the friends in the Demoscenes group had some tunes and some graphics to share with it. So we made a music disc or music cartridge, not physical cartridge, but the ROM.
A release.
Yeah, and it contained some nice tunes, and yeah, it was my first 8-bit demo, actually.
Nice. And have you gone into Game Boy Audio in some way, Ace?
Only a little bit. 2013 or so, just quickly listening like that, but nothing really in depth.
Yeah, it's a interesting system. It has a lot of variations as well. So it's its own whole. Speaking about how each Game Boy model and each iteration, since they had backwards compatibility, how each one changed the sound. There's so much to dig in there. But and what happened next in your path, Ace? How did you move on then from what we left?
Well, from the Genesis stuff, it then proceeded to, well, it was also at the same time that I was getting the Mega Amp done that I was considering getting myself a one-chip MSX, but already back in 2013, the prices were just way outside of what I wanted to pay for one. So I saw that it was ported to the Terrasic D0 dev board with a Cyclone 3. So I ended up purchasing one and getting that up and running. And I was actually starting to tinker a bit with that to mostly try to have simultaneous outputs. So added an extra R2R ladder in order to generate a composite signal while still having RGB coming out the VGA plug. And then also wired up a cartridge slot so I could run actual MSX cartridges on the on the this one chip MSX port
Mm-hmm.
because I was never really satisfied with the implementations of the Konami SCC sound chip. Because there seems to be an oddity with it where if you keep repeating the same note over and over again, every time it's repeated, it will change. It will the overall sound signature changes. It's like it gets more gritty, then gets smoother, and keeps going back and forth like that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And you will especially hear this in Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. And it was that which then led me on to MiSTer because, well, at the time I was actually doing university studies where some of my courses were actually using FPGAs in VHDL, which I know that several devs don't particularly like on MiSTer. But I did start with that, and in 2018, when Smoke Monster started to show this off, that's when I thought, okay, I might actually have something here. So prior to that, I ended up getting a couple of bootleg Arkanoid boards, and I figured, okay, this looks like it might be a good start, being as it's mostly discrete logic, not much in the way of custom hardware. The only real custom chip was a Fujitsu shift register, which was really just basically 2 shift registers with muxes multiplexers for each output so that it's either going to output a left shift or a right shift. But it turned out to be not quite what I expected, mostly because this was my first big FPGA project, a full system, and I took things very literally at the time. So going as far as to look up the data sheets for every single logic IC, modeling the chips, retracing the board, because Taito's schematics were not only incomplete but also erroneous. And I would
typical,
assume...
right?
Say that again?
Typical, right?
Well, at least for Taito, it seems to have been a thing with their schematics in particular, because I was looking at that, tracing the board, and hardly anything lined up. But the main complexity with Arkanoid for me at the time was it used some of this discrete logic in very weird ways, mostly to try to get 16 bits of VRAM down to the 8-bit bus of the Z80. So it was essentially almost gating, I guess in a way, one of the RAM chips, one of the RAM banks. So I had to have Electron Ash give me a hand on that because until that was going, I couldn't get the game to even start. So once he got that going, then it started to get a bit better, but there's still the limitation of the Motorola MC68705 microcontroller. To this day, I have not found a good open source implementation of the underlying HC05 CPU core. So right now it's using a workaround with patched bootleg ROMs in order to get around this issue, because
this is please let them know why that is the case.
Yeah, well, it's because the microcontroller it serves 2 things. One is to actually read the spinner inputs, and the other one is actually for protection purposes. But being as there is a dump that exists, not just for that, but also Tournament Arkanoid, the issue is that because there is no good implementation out there now, I'd have to pretty much make my own from scratch. Right now, I'm not really at that level yet. So that was the workaround done in order to get the game out. And for the most part, it works. The only issue I can see right now is that the lowest difficulty setting is currently too easy because the enemy spawns are not quite correct. And I'm assuming this probably due to the lack of the MC68705's internal timer. So I'm hoping someday to be able to get back to Arkanoid and fix that up. But in general, that's how that implementation was. It's still like that to this day. I would like to rebuild it, but even if I do rebuild it, I am going to archive the old code, mostly because of Taito's incomplete and bogus schematics, in a sense. So that way, if someone wants to, say, make new schematics, they can look through the code and make something off of that.
But thing is it published somewhere that the schematics are wrong and that's the reference?
I don't think there is actual publications for that. The only thing I can say for sure is that while retracing the board, the signals didn't match. And also many signals are completely missing. Some ICs aren't even shown in the schematics.
To anybody in the audience that wants to retrace the schematics, there's something that can be done to preserve arcade in a better way. I mean, the code is a documentation, but what I mean, or what probably would help the general community, is to have people know that the code is correct regarding the PCB and the schematics are wrong, right? That's the kind of information that needs to be put out there.
Yeah, we have that information out, as well as corrected schematics to fix up whatever Taito deliberately, or at least I would assume deliberately, omitted, or otherwise just
obfuscated.
Yeah, obfuscated or put the wrong signal names.
Interesting. You've also been quite active in arcade, and I believe that we'll have a lot to talk about this, Blackwine. And arcade is quite different from consoles and even from home computers like the Amiga, because most, not all, but most are unique implementations that play only one game, right? Or a family that evolved and each iteration just played a game and was not fully taken complete all of its power shown, right? It's kind of a one shot, and they were sold, and they're unique computers. I love them because they are like these small music boxes that are unique pieces that you can just plug them, and they are embedded systems. That's what I mean. You have their own world in a proper computer that has its own input, CPU, RAM, video. And what's your experience on arcade, and what got you going into arcade, Blackwine?
Well, it's of course started as a player. I used to go to arcades and play mostly shmups. It was something that attracted me.
Any kind or titles that you remember from the era?
Yeah, sure. The Raiden was one of the first, I think.
Seibu Kaihatsu.
Yeah, and of course the cave shmups, the later contenders were cave shmups, and the Bullet House and something like that. Yeah.
And you had access to games like Raiden back in the day then? And,
in the arcades, yeah.
Were there any difference from the arcades shown in the American movies, or were they quite similar?
Well, I can't remember them from the movies, really. The titles that were shown.
No, I meant the places, the venues.
Oh, I think the ones in the movies were surely bigger. The one I visited was some stinky small shop.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, but that didn't matter. The game was the something that hooked you up to this. So yeah, and we were watching mostly, not playing. So that there were some skilled players, and it's. I was too young to have some good money to spare. So yeah, it looked like this, and when I've got my first real arcade, it was I think 2015 or 2016. In 90s, I was into emulation. Especially Neo Geo, that was something that stood out back then, and Metal Slug series. It looked, all the sprites, colors, and
that pixel art.
Yes, and that was a step up from Amiga for sure. So I played it a lot, and in 2015 I bought my first Neo Geo board.
Which model was it?
The first one, MV1. I think MV1A. I think is the full name of it. The big one, quite a big one.
I like those.
Yeah, I had to fix it because it was there was some calendar error or something like that. But it didn't took me too long.
Good.
And now I have I think 3 of Neo Geo boards. Quite a lot of cards, not all because they're
the market
expensive.
went crazy.
Yeah, but yeah, that's the arcade system I played the most and enjoyed it a lot. Of course, there are other systems like CPS2 is really something remarkable. First encountered on emulated on PSP, I think. I got my PSP in 2008, maybe, and I think there were first emulators of this system back then, and Arashi was the thing I loved to play. And now I have also PGM, but not really much interesting
There's
cartridges.
interesting games on the PGM, but it's you have if you like beat 'em ups, try playing the Gladiator. It's a 4-player beat 'em up, and also the Knights of Baylor ones. And the shoot 'em ups, well, you get Dodonpachi 2, which is a curious little thing.
Yeah. The cave shmups are there. I am on the list for the PCBs on arcade.
The cards, right?
Yeah. To roll my own cartridges.
Just as a note for the public, these games were all-in-one PCBs: Ketsui, Dodonpachi, Daioyo, and Espgaruda. And they are releasing open source, right? Hardware PCBs to build your own custom cards.
Yeah.
On that note, sorry to interrupt you, but we got some questions that I'd like to address, since they are asking if PGM or CPS3 would be viable on the MiSTer. What you guys think?
Yeah, I think those would probably be viable platforms. I can't say that I would personally work on those, but I think MiSTer has enough capabilities to be able to handle both.
Yeah, CPS3 curiously has an FPGA for video as well.
I think it uses the same CPU as the Saturn as well.
Yeah, it's an SH2.
Yeah.
And PGM uses 68,000, but the cards have an ARM CPU, as far as I know. And they use their own audio hardware that is also wavetable, similar to the SEC and Amiga that was mentioned before, with very different capabilities. So I think it's in the realm of the possible. What do you think, Blackwine?
Those cars, well, if we can have Saturn, we can have STV, but I don't know much about PGM internals, so I can't elaborate on that too much.
And they are asking also.
Yeah, but the CPUs are not it's M6 8K, so most stuff, I think.
It's the usual, right? You have the customs to blame because the PGM has a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And they do all the video and audio mixing and processing in general. And the cards have this ARM CPU for protection, which I don't know to which extent they're used. I understand that they are used also to, like an MCU, to protect and do some enemy routines and AI and input validation.
Yeah, and switch regions, I think.
That's also true. And they also have their own BIOS inside the card, right?
Yes. They have shared RAM, I think.
Oh, yeah.
With M6 8K CPU. Well, MiSTer has also, ARM 7 CPU on board, so maybe it can be used for these tasks as well.
Yeah, that would be interesting. And for those that don't know what PGM is, it's an arcade platform very similar to Neo Geo, but that was released on the later years of the Neo Geo. It was much. It is much newer. It was, I believe, it was 90s, end of 90s or the start of the 2000s that it was released. It's a red PCB. It's really cute. I love it, and it has a bunch of interesting games.
Yeah, that's especially shmups. Although you know it's also not so great design when you compare to Neo Geo, especially when you look at cartridges, because for example, the Neo Geo card has two PCBs, and you know the ground is on the sides, and the current flows in the middle of the board. So when you insert it upside down, you won't do anything to the Neo Geo main board, but not so with PGM. So there are some some little things like this with PGM that are not so well thought as on Neo Geo, but the hardware is really interesting. The what they were able to achieve with games on this platform.
And have you seen any of these systems, Ace?
Personally, no.
They're also asking if there's something that people that want to or know hardware languages can quickly learn to help contribute. Things that make a lot of man hours but aren't necessarily skilled work.
Well, if you have a software background, the number one suggestion I'd say is to look up for some examples of small Verilog tutorials that you can quickly put together and have run on the hardware that directly, because the syntax is actually fairly close to what you'd see in C, C++. The main thing, though, is to kind of switch the mindset over from, because code is usually sequential, unless you're doing any sort of heavy multi-threading, but in general, code is usually done line by line. But in hardware terms, if you were to have, say, a block of code, all that would be executed at the same time. So say you were trying to latch a signal, or a series of signals, you'd have all of them going in at the same time if all of those signals are defined as being latched within that block.
Yeah, and he also probably means something like tracing or work that could be done like man hours as well. He mentioned about tracing PCBs or that kind of work if they could help.
Yeah, the main thing with tracing boards is you need a lot of patience, because several of these boards will actually have traces that run under ICs. You'll see the vias that start underneath a chip. And sometimes in order to relocate that, unless you desolder everything and just have a bare board, it's going to be quite tedious and time-consuming to be able to trace everything out. But the main thing to have, if you want to trace something, is a multimeter that is able to do continuity testing.
For those listening and don't know, what that is, continuity testing is when you place a beeper that sounds whenever there's contact between the two tips. And what you do is place one tip in the suspicious trace and search for the other place. You brush it and somewhere carefully and find out where it leads to. Obviously, it would be better to have visual confirmation first, or a visual suspicion, and then confirm wherever it goes. Am I missing something there?
But the process itself, you really have to commit a lot of time to it. I mean, just retracing Arkanoid, I don't even remember how long it took, but it was very long. And especially when I started to get into some of the more advanced Konami hardware, trying to get trying to figure out what the bootlegs did in particular next to the originals. Oh, let me tell you, those boards have some of the most disorganized trace layouts I've ever come across.
The bootlegs, you mean?
Yeah, they run so many traces under ICs, left, right, and center. And the thing, too, is that the actual PCB layout for all the different subsections is scattered everywhere. There is no rhyme or reason to where anything is placed.
Mm-hmm. And have you had any experience? I bet you have with this, Blackwine.
And with retracing, no, really.
Well, for your repairs, I bet you have, right? Not specifically to recreate the schematic, but
yeah, but no, it was. I didn't get into this level to trace or draw schematics out of it or convert it to FPGA code yet, at least.
And what draw you into going back into some of these platforms? Because you've worked, Blackwine, in Burger Time, for example, Draga, Donkey Kong. What can you tell us about those platforms and the difference and what drove you into those?
Okay, so I must say I didn't release full course of it. I was in need to enhance this course and add the flip screen to it. The reason was simple because I mostly use CRTs, and these are vertical games or tate mode games. So and the early 8-bit games that there was no standard. Should they be rotated 90 degrees to the left or counterclockwise or clockwise? And with my CRT, I can really only rotate it counterclockwise because of strange, magnetic artifacts on screen when I turn it the other way. So I was just in need to do the flip screen to just get it to play on my setup. So I took this open source course and extended it. With most of this course, it was just it. I did a bit more with Galaga to do some filters because it sounded really bad. I am sure it's not perfect yet, the version that is in the official repo, but I think I can work a bit on it more and get it perfect. Of course, with the best would be to have this hardware and record the sound from it and re-implement, but it in FPGA. But it's not always the case. So we have to rely on schematics and sometimes people provide it, but it's hard to get.
It's become very expensive, right?
Yes.
Now that you mentioned video hardware, I'm sure you both have some opinions on how things are done in general with arcade PCBs, schematics, emulation, and MiSTer regarding the video hardware part of arcade PCBs. What do you have to say on that?
Well, it's with discrete hardware, it's quite simple, but with all those custom chips, it's if you can decap the chip. If you can do a photo under microscope and recreate on the gate level every operation that happens there, so then you can have 100% accuracy, but it's also this is really time consuming to get this stuff, and only few people do it, I think. So yeah, it will take some time to get these chips really 100% replicated in the FPGA.
Yeah, if your objective is to actually reproduce the exact method by which, say, a custom chip goes to access VRAM in order to grab any parameters to do with tile maps or sprites, oftentimes you'll have a single large bank of RAM which contains everything in one, and the inner logic of the custom IC will then multiplex all the addressing that will go into the chip and all the data inputs as well. Data I/O. So there is that, but there's also, you can sometimes, or actually you could for the most part, simplify that by having your RAM banks already split. I mean, you do bypass that particular part of the logic, but if your objective is really just to get the game itself going, targeting specifically the FPGA without wanting to actually recreate the custom chip, that would be one way to do it. It would save some time that way, because then you don't have to figure out the logic that is actually used in order to grab the required data at the exact moment in time that it's supposed to be grabbed out of VRAM to address ROM, let's say. That's how Konami typically does it, that you have everything in RAM, and the data that comes back from that is then used to address ROM, which is then put through the rest of the video logic to then be output as pixel data for either a set of PROMs or color RAM.
And of course, there are several questions around that. Blackwine already mentioned that he made those modifications to the hardware to flip, right? That's something that's not that was not the original functionality, and it's something that's added for convenience. And it goes in this same direction of modifying the original way that it worked to have a more convenient implementation. What are your thoughts on that and preferences? And what do you think? Because some people believe that everything is already known about these platforms, right? They're so old and we have so much technology. What are your thoughts on this? I know I'm throwing a big topic at you guys, but what do you think?
Oh, no, it's fine. But in general, I think that there are still hidden secrets, especially with hardware whose custom chips were not really fully documented. You might sometimes end up with situations where you think you know the logic inside and out, but then when you go to actually try to implement it, you end up hitting either hitting a wall, or you end up finding something that doesn't line up at all, and you have to go and figure out from there what it is you're missing. But at the same time, adding functionality I don't think is necessarily a bad idea. Although, for my particular case, my main thing is really to recreate the experience of using the PCB as it was. So, having the entire feature set exactly as it was, barring high score saving, because, well, that seems to be a pretty big thing. And at least on some original boards, you can fairly easily add some kits in order to add that functionality to them. But for some other things like flip screen logic, some boards actually have that already.
It's the same, well, not accessible, right?
No, it depends on the hardware. Some of them will have it either specifically for flipping the screen for when they're using a cocktail cabinet. Others will have it already in the hardware, toggleable via a dip switch.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, though, especially in the case of if you have only a cocktail flip mode, that would require actually exploiting the functionality in order to allow a flip screen outside of the standard flipping the screen for a two-player cocktail setup.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think, Blackwine? What's your preference, or what thoughts do you have on this?
Of course, most important thing is to get this designs right and 100% accurate. But I think that for example, for me that flip screen functionality, solve some problem, some real
And
problem.
for a lot of people, right?
Yeah. And like high score saving or pause feature, for example, I think there are three the most important functionalities.
Quality of life.
Yeah, that help us with this stuff. So of course, it's important to get the design right. It would be perfect if this additional functionalities could be implemented the way that are transparent to the general design. This is not always the case, but we can improve upon.
Yes, of course. It's an iterative process, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You strive for something, but you have to work with what you have and what you can at the moment.
Yeah, and it's great with MiSTer that it's open source project, and you can start with what has been already done, but extend it or improve on or make it more accurate. Yes.
And we talked about video. It's something that has always interested me because I've repaired a few PCBs, and repairing the video section of a PCB is interesting, to say the least. Especially when usually the schematics don't have it documented, right? It's kind of a part that's left out, specifically in Konami words. But somebody is asking us in the chat about what does it mean when a game has analog sound, and can that be implemented on an FPGA?
From what I understand, looking at schematics of some of those games, it looks to me like it's all done with discrete components, so logic ICs, NE555 style timers, those sorts of things, along with RC filters everywhere. Galaxian is one example that comes to mind, Donkey Kong as well. I haven't personally looked into implementing those direct on the FPGA, but I think it might be possible to get a fairly decent approximation, provided, especially with circuits that are based off timers, actually measuring how those timers function. At the very least, simulating in, I guess you could say, a SPICE type software, how the circuit would work if it was to just function standalone, and be able to model that then on the FPGA. Then with RC filters, you could do what I do, which is to take the audio filter from the Genesis core that Sultan worked on, and adjust that to all the different cutoff frequencies. It works best for low-pass filtering. I had trouble with high-pass filtering, which I had to use for Jackal, but had to use a bit of a hacky way to do it. So for that, it's still a bit up in the air for high-pass filtering. But for low-pass filtering, Sultan's filters are good for that. I'm also seeing a question from, let me see, who was it that said that?
Oh, regarding the bubble memory on the Konami systems?
No, it was something before that. Lemonici had said, is there a generalizable benefit to replicating processes exactly versus the simplifications?
Yes.
The main thing is being able to create replacements for the original custom ICs. If you're able to get the entire process down, get the signaling exact, you could then pull the code out, maybe tweak it a bit for things like bidirectional buses, because on an FPGA, you generally have your data input and data output as separate signals, but on the original ICs, you'll have both selectable on the same set of pins. So you'd have to add that in as logic to deal with that. Then you could put it on a smaller FPGA, just a standalone little board that you could then plug in place of the original chip.
And you'd like to do that because they get damaged and there's no way to substitute them unless you take it off from another damaged PCB.
Yeah, and a good number of them, especially on the Konami side, are not reliable at all.
Yeah, and probably they'd like to know, just as a small detour, why do they fail? Do you want to go into that? What happens with electronics and how they failed? Probably in this particular case.
From what I can tell, at least with those that are manufactured by Fujitsu, and this is a problem as well with their logic ICs, it's the interconnections between the pins and the die which separate over time.
And also by small mechanical vibrations and drops and that kind of thing.
Potentially,
right?
yes.
Yeah, that affects electronics, any electronics.
Yeah.
So.
And there are two other questions. I'm going to touch on the bubble memory question because this is a big one. It's like a ROM. It's non-volatile storage, so whatever data you write to it will stay. But the thing is, it's actually magnetic storage. It's not electrical the way a ROM is. You could think of it a bit like a tape in that it's not only magnetic storage, but it's also, you got little segments that are referred to as bubbles, which get directed to wherever the data is getting read from. The thing with that is it proved to be very unreliable because, especially in arcades, Konami bubble system boards were highly prone to failure to the point where Konami themselves actually had full replacement CPU boards and converted those games to use ROMs instead. That's what MAME emulates for the most part, but bubble system emulation has started to come up in MAME. The thing is, the microcontroller that's used to actually interface the bubble memory to the entire CPU area hasn't been recreated. So that whole functionality right now is still not exactly known.
Yeah. And that's what we kind of were getting at. There's a lot of information that's not available yet, and having a project like MiSTer helps for this information to be useful beyond PCB owners to make repairs.
It's useful everywhere. It's useful for PCB owners. It's useful for, even in a sense, you could, in theory, create a design where you have sockets that you can put the original ROMs from a dead board, for instance, and have those interface to the FPGA, while the FPGA itself has all the logic that will then give you the game. That would be one way to do it. One more question regarding clone boards as a good substitute for reverse engineering. That, for the most part, the answer is no, because a lot of these are not cloned properly. And I can cite Jackal and Iron Horse specifically because, okay, first of all, those two games gave me all sorts of problems, especially with the sprite logic. But the main thing, Jackal was first. That one took so many shortcuts to the point where it only recreates one of the Konami 005885 custom chips and shoves the data for both into that one clone. But the end result is flawed because the video timings are wrong, the actual main clock is too slow, so everything just doesn't operate properly. The CPUs are underclocked, the video timings are too fast. That's one thing. Second thing is blanking the actual horizontal blank, which is the blanking. You could consider that as the black border around the active area. The thing with Jackal in this case is that the clone boards and part of the visible area is actually masked because blanking starts too early. But the main issue here is sprites tend to there are two lines on the complete right side, either to the left or to the right. When the screen is shown normally, sprites are missing two lines on one side. The sprites themselves are missing their very last line, and when you flip the screen, problems get even worse because you still have those drawing errors, but at the same time, the sprite layer is offset by one line, so you end up having some graphics that are generated on both tile map and sprite layers. They will be slightly separated. The other issue with Iron Horse specifically, again, you have the blanking issues. But the thing with this one is that the sprite limit is not correct, and it has a tendency to exhibit sprite flickering, which is something the original board doesn't have. But the main thing here is the other thing with Iron Horse is explanation I can come up with in order to or regarding rather the timing of the actual drawing of sprites to the screen, because if you look at the README for Jackal and Iron Horse, the games currently render sprites one frame ahead of time. And the only way I can see to actually delay that is to use a frame buffer, which for Jackal right now, like, I'm not really experienced with frame buffers, so I don't really have any idea what to do about that. So, for right now, the cores will remain as they are until I get some more information. But the thing with the clone boards is that they actually do recreate this properly. It's just, for whatever reason, maybe due to a timing error, sprites for Iron Horse are not properly read out of VRAM and grabbed from ROM to then be put into the sprite buffer. Jackal seems to get this right, but the fact that it's not drawn fully leads me to believe that somewhere there is either something that ends at the wrong time, or for whatever reason only grabs a partial amount of data.
See, yeah, arcade is quite a bit like that, and it's usually hard to work with it, because even if you have the PCB, as Ace mentioned, you have to dismantle it to trace it properly, right?
For the most part, especially when you end up with some of these clone boards, they are practically the size of two boards combined into one. They are massive in comparison to the originals.
Mm-hmm. Because all customs are just gutted, right? Well,
yeah, it's essentially you're blowing up the custom chips. You're taking whatever is inside a small ceramic or plastic package and trying to scatter that as a bunch of discrete logic ICs.
It's because, as I understand it, these customs are basically a way for the company to save on processes that are already used in several PCBs, and they build the custom and use it forward, right?
For the most part, but I'd say the main purpose is really to make cloners' lives miserable.
Of course.
For the most part. That I think is the primary focus, more so than actually saving on production costs. And to add to that, the importance of preserving the clone boards, I go for it. And I did that with Jackal, I did that with Iron Horse, because the oddities of these bootlegs are usually not documented at all. Or I guess in some instances as well, these bootlegs are probably relatively unknown.
There's also the matter of culture. You know, a lot of people play these clones instead of the original board.
That too.
And that gives them value. And gives them value in several terms. First of all, it's an auxiliary part in diagnosis like Blackwine and Ace make. It helps. It might not be the perfect solution, but it helps.
Yeah, it's the same sort of thing with Arkanoid. Some clone boards, or at least a good chunk of them by the looks of things, have AY3 8910s on them instead of the YM2149, which the problem with that is Arkanoid uses the YM2149's internal clock divider. That doesn't exist on the AY3 8910, so the sound is double pitch.
Wow.
And that's something which you can recreate with an FPGA if you base your design off a YM2149, because then you could just disable the clock divider. You get the same end result.
Yeah. Yeah, so to round that up, yes, clones are valuable for research, for documentation, and in terms of general documentation as it's regarded in MAME, for example, when you're dumping something, you don't have to select. Selecting is when you're preserving something that's not been preserved before, it's not an option, because everything will decay, everything will rot, and if we don't document it now, we have the chance in our hands right now.
That's
probably
That's especially true with games that have a lot of custom hardware on them. For bootlegs, the main thing is any programmable logic, get that dumped immediately, or at the very least brute forced. Get that done right away, so that way, even if discrete logic fails, you could always replace it, because it's just off the shelf and it's still in production.
Yeah, but the custom code that's inside of those devices is not. Like, also PALs and GALs, it's an issue because most people don't dump them, and MAME didn't use them.
Yeah, that's the main thing with bootlegs in particular, because a lot of them will use those programmable ICs.
Could you explain them what these are?
Well, I guess you could consider them as, instead of having a circuit with a bunch of gates, you would instead get these chips and figure out your logic design, then have them essentially burn in the chip, so to speak. So instead of having just a massive layout, you have that one chip that does all the logic you want.
I like
Or
to think
at
them
least
as
with
a precursor of an FPGA, a very caveman-like
it's
precursor.
very crude in comparison because it's just like very basic gates inside. I don't remember the exact internal structure, but it you could think of it as sort of a very primitive form of what would become CPLDs, then FPGAs.
Mhm.
And regarding this, Blackwine, what have you been your issues when working on all these PCBs in terms of implementation?
Well, um, I work usually on more on programmers level, or
Mm-hmm.
I'm not electric engineer or electronic type of guy. I'm assembler coder originally, so my most experience was with that kind of stuff. Although with MiSTer, I learned a lot about these things, but I'm not an expert. I don't feel like an expert
That's the
CPU.
most valuable part of it, I believe. And one thing that I bet everybody would like to know is how you got introduced to MiSTer in that sense, and how did you started handling it and learning?
Yeah. So well, I got into the MiSTer and at the start of this year, actually. So it was really recent times, and just I was encouraged to play. Well, for example, Progress Arashi and
Mm-hmm.
some CPS games which were coming out early in this year, and that was first step, and the second thing was I wanted this flip screen functionality
Mm-hmm.
originally to bomb jack. So
That's a very interesting game, as a matter of
yeah.
fact.
Yeah, I love to play it, but I couldn't play it on my CRT, so I I think it was in early March, I I got the quarters installed, and started to tinker with the sources that were available, and well, for a person with experience with assembly language, FPGA is interesting because it's really low level. It's even lower level than assembly, but for sure, if you can do assembly, I think you can also get into FPGA, and sometimes this is assembly coding skill can help. For example, with Super Pac-Man.
Mm-hmm.
The Hotego has made improved the core to enable this game, but it's freezed in the first phase of the self mode test, and I could dive into it and disassemble and check what really happens there, and patch the MRA
Mm-hmm.
to enable this to run. So this was like cracking a thing, um, but with the time I'm learning new things, and that's great. So that you can make people happy, enabling some games, some functionalities, and also learn to how to do this stuff.
And we also got the question that how did you first learn to edit and compile things in MiSTer? Did you go through Alden's tutorials, or did you already have some idea about Quartus? And I'll add, how difficult was it for you?
What? How? Maybe I'll start with the last question. How difficult was it? Well, the scope was the small enough, so I didn't have to have this whole picture. So I think we certainly that assembly experience helped. So I don't think that was that difficult, and but that's the point. If you have this working course, that what Ace said in the beginning of this event, that you can start with this and progress upon it. So yeah, and well, I think the first part of the first question was about the Quartus, and this is the simplest part to set it up, I think, and the fine thing is really portable. So not like with C and C++ when you want to develop for different platforms. That there's a lot of code to get it running there, and with Quartus and MiSTer, the single platform, it becomes easy because you don't have to care about many things. But I can tell how that would be if you don't do any programming, for example, or you don't have experience with electronics on low level. It may take some time to get these things right.
And for you, Ace, how was the process? Was it easy? What did you follow? Of course, you already had some previous experience with FPGAs.
I just went back to my previous experience from having worked with the Cyclone 3 and very old versions of Quartus back to when it was version 9. Just went back to that, and I had done some Verilog as well in college at the time, so went back to that after I started to convert Arkanoid to Verilog. I was into VHDL at the time that I was working on Arkanoid because that's what I was learning in university, but from there it's just to grab whatever experience I had prior and roll with it.
And there's something, of course, here in common that we've touched a bit. You have the Crunch and Demo Party Blackwine, and we haven't talked about that. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. One more thing I would like to say: if you want to learn, doing course and the course that Ace did are really great reference. I had to say this, but it's very well commented. Like every blog has comments, so you can read it like a book, and really. When you want to start, go there. Yeah, and for the question, yes, the Crunch Demo Party, and well, we would have to say what the Demoscene is, because many people might not know. But yeah, it's the cracking scene or scene we were talking about earlier. Was something that Demoscene originated. So you had this, crack intro with the tiny executable with music, logo, scroll text before you run a game, and it evolved from there. So there was. These intros became demos where people start putting some nice effects like raster bar effects you mentioned, but also some more advanced stuff like vectors, 3D vectors or texture map vectors later, and yeah, this started the movement of Demoscenes, which is really popular in Europe. I don't think that much in other parts of the world, but this changes, and it's something like in a nutshell, it's Demoscene is a subculture of making art using computers. So people do graphics, music, or this executable demos to show off what's possible with a given machine, or what you can do. How far can you push your skills? And we run demo parties. These are events when you can release this nice graphics, music, and demos, and compete with other folks or groups of folks.
See what everyone else got during that year or months or whatever, right? And impress each other.
Yes. It's a bit like with consoles, because it works the best with old computers, where you have this fixed machine, and not there is Demoscene on PC, but it's not that much interesting to me personally, because of this factor that you have to have the limited machine, not a moving object, so you can really squeeze out of it as much as you can, like with the console games. Early console games are not that advanced like the games from the the later years. So it's also really nice that a lot of stuff is released at demo parties for Commodore 64, for example, and for me also I was into Demoscene until 2001, I think. That was my last demo party. I went in early days, and I had a 10 or 11 years break.
Wow.
And then in 2012 I've got my first Commodore 64 and went to a party called X. It's in Netherlands, and there were 400 people doing only Commodore 64 stuff. In that year, that was something I'd say shocking that people do that stuff and release so many good productions. Yeah, that was something, some revelation for me. Then I went to DataStorm to Sweden, and I've seen all these Amigas there, and that it still lived, and it actually renewed my interest in old hardware, I think, and to the urge to do something with it, to program it or do some music, also some pixeling, and yes, this is I think is a very large topic, and you would have to, if you would like to explore Demoscene, I would recommend to watch some documentaries like Moment 2. Actually, its full name is Moment 2 Demoscene, The Art of the Algorithms. And the other one is Art of Breaking Ground, which is on YouTube, I think. And it was shot at several demo parties, including our own DCrunch in 2016, if I remember correctly. And it tells a story about our local Amiga scene. There's webpage demoparty.net when you can follow these events. They do streaming, especially since start of the pandemic. Many parties only happened, online. It returns to the older state where you just wanted to go to the actual party and wanted to experience it in person.
Not the same thing.
Yeah, it's really important because especially when you release something and you see it on the big screen, it's something that drives you to do more of this stuff.
The ambient is electrifying, I can imagine.
Yes.
And just out of curiosity, did more people assist virtually or physically?
I think pandemic of course had impact on it. And I think also it's the amount of releases increased during the pandemics.
Of course.
Maybe because people spent more time at their homes or whatever, but
anxiety.
Yeah, but I've been to one party. Two parties because we pulled off DeCrunch last year. It was in August, early August, so it was safe enough back then. But a little bit crazy. Not much people there, but it's starting to recover. So I think more people now will want to go to these parties because the break was really long, and it's important to also to meet people that are into it. Yes.
Yeah, and of course these demos are heavy on showing off with the effects, 3D, audio, video, colors, and produce sound and video that's way beyond of what you'd expect from the platform. Using every trick, right?
Yes, and every year brings something new onto these old platforms. So yeah, you have to.
Oh, sorry. What I find interesting about this is, do all of these demos run on MiSTer?
Well, I think many should run. I didn't test that much of this stuff on the MiSTer because I have this computers like Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, Amiga, Atari ST. As an organizer of DCrunch, I have to own this so we can provide the real hardware. And that's the really interesting question. If MiSTer can help Demoscene, because there was always a question of emulators in Demoscene.
Of course.
And it's like that. They're very important for development, so you can code on the go, for example, this stuff.
Faster cycles.
Yeah, but we don't know. We don't want demos that run only on emulators, and it can happen when you develop something on not 100% accurate emulator for 3 months, and then you test it on the real machine, and it can differ because still these emulators aren't perfect.
Yeah, they take shortcuts, and everything takes shortcuts as we discussed. But what I was getting at in general, just as you mentioned, it could be helpful because it will help just as an emulator, but in a different kind of cycle, but a fast one in development. But usually these demos break emulators, like you mentioned. And that's why I asked, because if they run properly, then they help validate the platform as a proper means of reproduction. Not saying that they would use MiSTers on these demonstrations. What I'm saying is these demonstrations and their results can help to evaluate the precision of FPGA implementations.
Yeah. They are like the great tests of this
stress tests,
test cases. Yes.
Yeah, even when developing the 240p test suite, I found out that emulation didn't. It helps me, as you mentioned. You have a fast cycle, but I usually develop with the USB connected directly to the console, flash card, or drop in MiSTer. But you have to jump between all those because things break down pretty easily. Yeah. And emulation and FPGA implementations could have differences with real hardware. And what I was getting at regarding audio and video is how important is it to you for these reproductions to have indetectable differences or no differences at all in audio and video results?
It's utmost important. So we have to these things 100% accurate if possible.
Could you elaborate a bit on the context of the question?
Oh yeah, sure. What's been the work that you've done in regards of audio and video signal integrity to be undistinguishable from the original hardware vintage implementation on MiSTer, and have you measured it?
Oh, I've tried to really be as close as possible, making sure, especially for things like video timings, IRQ timings in particular. Those are the main ones when it comes to actually timing the logic. So what I would do a lot would be, well, not just with the scope, but just to get a baseline is to go through the OSSC. It's not quite perfect, but it does at least give a good indication of what the actual frequencies are. So from there you could then play around with the horizontal and vertical counters, which those are used in order to really get the timings down. You would have a pixel clock, which is the frequency at which the hardware is actually drawing pixels on the screen. So from there you then have to get the correct amount of horizontal lines and vertical lines in order to get the exact timings down, along with that proper pixel clock. In some cases, I'll take the example of the Konami 082 custom chip. With that one, you can actually brute force it, actually pump a low to high pulse into the clock input, and you can see with LEDs connected to the output the exact values that it will increment between. And that's what I did in order to get the timings right for, at the time it was Time Pilot 84, making sure that everything is exact, even down to the actual centering of the analog output. Because Konami games do have very awkward centering where it gets shifted to the right side of the screen, but it also gets a vertical offset so far up that part of the visible area ends up an overscan on a consumer-grade CRT or just any consumer-grade display in general.
That's a really interesting point because on a topic, because I've noticed that in many cases, like for example, I don't know, consoles, the video signal is as presented by MiSTer on an analog domain is it's kind of an idealized version, right?
For the most part, yeah.
And that's very interesting because when I got my MiSTer, I expected everything to be on par with the original hardware, but then I understood that having an idealized version that's up to the same levels for each one of the consoles and centered in the same way it serves its own different purpose, right?
Yeah, then there's also a thing of the age of the hardware. Sometimes you'll end up with a bit of drifting on the clocks, so you might end up with, you have essentially what is a theoretical ideal model, especially with the precision of the PLL that's in the in the Cyclone 5 on the DE10 Nano, which, for those who don't know what that does, it's used in order to generate other frequencies within the FPGA. The board itself has a 50 megahertz clock that is taken in, And from there, you can configure a PLL in order to, say, increase the frequency if necessary, or otherwise bring it down to something that would then be divisible by an integer factor to whatever frequencies you need for your system.
Okay. And if it's always the case that you end up with the exact frequencies you want from that process?
In general, yeah. PLLs they're a lot more precise than they used to be. I'm going to cite the PlayStation as an example where sometimes it could go a little bit askew, because with the PU20 and later PlayStations, rather than use the actual main clocks at 53 plus megahertz, they're the same ones as on the Genesis and also on the PAL Mega Drive, 53.693175 megahertz for NTSC, 53.2034 megahertz for PAL. Rather than have those, later PlayStations replaced them with slower clocks going through a PLL to multiply the clocks back up to the desired frequency for whatever video standard is supposed to be output by that particular console. Those seem to run a little bit slower. And this is something that I was able to see by sampling streaming audio and looking at the timestamp of the recordings through the same sound card. So consistently, the ones that had the PLL would always have timestamps that would be a little bit further ahead or further in time than the earlier revisions from PU7 to PU18, indicating that the PLL systems are running that little bit slower. It's not to the point where it will be perceptible, but the slower speed is still present. It's not so much the case with modern PLLs anymore.
Interesting. And that's something that we had to live with, and it's not noticeable today, like the SNES with the ceramic resonator having different...
that is one of the worst examples when it comes to inconsistencies, because you'll even get inconsistencies within the same hardware revision, and even
your same system.
Yeah, exactly. You had determined that yourself on the same system. Over time, from heat buildup, you can have your ceramic resonator drift.
Yeah, but it's something interesting that you can argue around preserving that or idealizing it, right?
Yeah, although this drift might actually not quite be... I wouldn't really know how to model that exactly to where... unless you were to, say, play around with the PLL, reconfiguring it over time, but you might end up messing up the entire system that way, because unless you have a dedicated PLL, which... Having tried that with Jackal at first, because the sound clock is completely different from the rest of the system, you could end up with compilation issues, either timing violations or your compile then never finishes because of a congestion issue.
I see. So it's more essential than I imagined, because we were joking around and Discord and talking about how you could define the temperature from the menu of what the model Super Nintendo system frequency would be.
Well, I mean, you could do something like that, where if you use, say, a fractional clock divider, you could potentially from there have it reconfigurable to, say, either varying temperature. Actually, that would probably be the better way to do it, to go with a fractional clock divider that keeps changing a little bit, either over time or with specific parameters you set in the core. That would be one way to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, because that's why the Toslink mods don't work in some audio receivers, right?
Yeah, because you end up with sample rates that are not a flat 32 kilohertz on different Super NES systems. Never mind hardware revisions, but even...
the same system. I bet you never get 32 kilohertz. Never, ever. You'd have to be like at 0 degrees.
Yeah, unless maybe you get a clone Super NES. Those seem to have very consistent... speed and pitch, but that's because they're all using crystals, not ceramic resonators. But the thing is, the clone chipsets appear to be analog only. The DACs are integrated within.
Interesting.
The thing too with the Super NES, and this was something that I had touched upon with in one of Bob's Retro RGB's roundups in 2018, was the stereo skewing on all Super NES revisions prior to SNS CPU RGB02. And that was from forcing the VREF pins from the UPD 637, I think it's a 6376, I might get the numbers wrong, but that DAC was having both of its VREF pins for the left and right outputs forced to the same voltage through a single 47 UF capacitor. So that worked for the UPD6379 on the SNS CPU RGB02 all the way up to the Mini. And when I say Mini, I mean the later 1997 revision, not the Classic Edition. I will explicitly refer to that one as the Super NES Classic Edition. But back to my point, it works for that being as it has a single VREF for both left and right outputs. The UPD6376, on the other hand, has separate outputs, separate VREFs for each of the left and right channels. So if you force both to the one capacitor, it appears to skew the balance to the left channel to varying degrees on a console-by-console basis. Sometimes it'll be very minute. Other times you could sometimes get like close to 2 decibels worth of difference. And the thing there would be to then break the link and put in the missing 47 UF capacitor. Then you'll get your balance back the way it should be.
Yeah, so Show is asking us regarding this topic, where do you draw the line? And what should we preserve then? Maybe the original iteration?
I'd say if there are obvious issues that have been corrected in later hardware revisions, have those perhaps be something optional alongside the fixed, the fixed, whatever's been fixed in later revisions.
And it's interesting. For example, the Genesis or Mega Drive core have the 2 synths available and filtering for several models. So it's up to if it's regarded as meaningful and the person that's implemented it.
It's definitely meaningful in that case. I used to take a hard line with the Genesis where it's get a system with a YM2612 or don't bother with it at all. But I've opened up to it after having seen a video where Fantasy Zone's arcade soundtrack was actually recreated with the YM3438. And it was so good that it practically sounded exactly like a YM2151. And in that case, that's where the YM34... That would be one instance where the YM3438 is actually the chip to go for. Because the fact that it has less of the ladder effect from the YM2612, it's still there, but it's almost inaudible. It makes the YM3438 a better target for trying to recreate the sound of a YM2151.
Which probably was what some developers did, right?
Possibly. I can't confirm that. But
of course.
Some sounds were brought over from the YM3812, which is the chip that was used in early Sound Blaster sound cards and the Adlib prior to that. So this was a thing mainly with Toaplan games. They used the YM3812 a lot. And those would then be brought over to the YM2612 when those games were ported over to the Genesis.
And man, I will love when we get Toaplan on the MiSTer.
Oh, yeah. About that, actually, the core looked like it was in a good state until sound was implemented, because it looks like there isn't really a good Yamaha OPL clone that goes beyond the... I forget what's the part number of the YM3812's predecessor.
It's let me
YM35 something. I can't remember the last 2 numbers.
I have them listed here. But while we go into that, what do you think about the Seath implementation, Blackwine? Have you tried that?
Which implementation? Sorry.
The Commodore 64 SID. The sound chip for the Commodore 64, since you've been also working on demos for that, right?
Not really. On Commodore 64, I only worked on pixels.
Pixels. Sorry, I misunderstood that.
Of course, I know the chip very well. I think it's probably the most. It gives most beautiful sound of all chips, even if there are only three channels. But the filters and stuff like that makes it really powerful device. But I think creation, especially the 6581, the earlier version, they can sound really differently with 8580 it's more consistent between chips, but I didn't deep dive into FPGA implementation. How good
Difference,
it is. Yeah. Of course, I would like to do some tests, but I can't speak right now how good it is.
And the YM3812, right, is one of them in the Choaplan PCBs.
That's what 12-plan PCBs use, but what I was referring to regarding implementations that are out there for Yamaha OPL family chips was the YM3526.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a whole world of stuff there.
Yeah, then when you start getting into the rabbit hole of OPL3 clones, oh my. There are a lot of them, and some are better than others.
Yeah, and some PCBs were manufactured with the clones, right? Choplin not in particular, but I bet that Korean versions.
I haven't really seen many of those, if any. I have seen a lot of bootlegs with fake YM2151s, though.
And talking about these, how difficult it is to work on the analog part of the PCBs when you implement them.
Oh, that's probably one of the more time-consuming parts of it, especially because, well, I mean, right now, MD4A, well, that's an essential thing, at least on the Genesis side of things, but for arcade boards, I have to go with I guess, maybe a bit more of a rudimentary method of not only listening by ear, but also being able to see the entire audio spectrum and making sure that the entire frequency range actually has the same amplitude between a reference recording from the PCB and a raw digital recording from the core over optical audio.
Mm-hmm. And we could get MD4A for every one of those. I think I have enough work for a lifetime to do that. I would love to.
Oh yeah, there are a lot of platforms. But if I can suggest perhaps a starter platform, try the Sega System C2. Because that's based on the Genesis. The only thing is that the Z80 doesn't exist on that one. Everything goes through a slightly faster 68,000.
And that's good, because MD4A on the Sega Genesis runs from the 68,000 processor.
Okay, so you should be able to... You might have to readjust for the Sega System C2's address space, but you still have the same Genesis VDP. You would, though, need to make a ROM that would be compatible with the UPD7759 ADPCM sound chip in order to measure the frequency response out of that. Have something maybe that produces the same sort of frequency sweep that the Sega CD part of the MD4A test for the Genesis would produce.
Yeah, we'd need to encode proper samples for that platform.
It would need to be ADPCM, although I don't know what sample rate would be required for that.
I can imagine that we can encode it with SOX like we did for the PC Engine.
I'm not sure about that, but it would likely be at a fairly low sample rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it would be a limited sweep on that regard. But yeah, that's something that somebody that's listening and that does code for any specific platform, you could help on creating an MD4A profile for... I would work on the profile on the analysis software, but if you can work on the side of coding for the platform, like coding a tone sweep generator for FM generator for any of these arcade PCBs or game platforms, that would help developers to approximate this sound better.
We've got a question regarding the YM2612's output. Yes, it is truncated from the raw 14-bit output down to 9 bits for the final analog output, which, if you think back to the Mega SG, that system is actually able to be switched between having the truncated 9-bit output or the full 14-bit output.
Mm-hmm.
And if I recall, MiSTer by default uses the truncated 9-bit output.
Yeah, since it's replicating the hardware.
Yes.
That was the intention. And there's also some other Konami PCB that you worked on, Time Pilot.
Yeah, Time Pilot 84 was the first one I did, but originally it was supposed to have been Gyrus, but the same day that I started to gather data for that game, Mr. X had actually teased that he was working on that, so I figured to just leave that to him. I went ahead and did Time Pilot 84 instead. And this was really what exposed how the literal model was really not the way to go. Because some of the code for the Konami custom chips was made in a way where it was actually producing unstable compiles. Like every couple of compiles, or even sometimes every compile, I'd get very inconsistent results, especially on the sprite side.
Wow.
So it was to the point where I just got fed up. I said, forget it. I'm going to throw all of this away. I'm going to start over with a brand new model, piece by piece. Just go little by little, because sometimes I would end up breaking the core to the point where I could not recover it, and I couldn't find where it was going wrong. So from then, I just changed my entire method of going for like one-to-one model, going for the identical clocks. I instead went with the usual, or the more typical method of a single base clock with a clock enable instead of the same frequency as the slower clocks on the board. It made a much more stable model.
Yeah, it's called meta stability, right?
That was really not good at all on Time Pilot 84 at first, to the point where different MiSTers were even producing glitches that I was not getting on mine.
That's
So that really prompted the entire rewrite of Time Pilot 84, and is a model that I even reused for the Gyrus rebuild, because what MiSTer X had done already was in a good state. There was still room for improvement, so I thought, okay, let me take what I did for Time Pilot 84 and rework that for Gyrus, which exposed a flaw in my implementation of the Konami 503 custom chip, because that game actually has faster timings for it, and with the way that I had the logic originally, it was too slow, and some of the sprites were getting misplaced on the screen or otherwise flickering. Then I had to find a way with a cycle-accurate model of the Motorola 6809E CPU by Greg Miller. That is a fairly meticulously crafted clone of the MC6809E. Konami put a encrypted version of this on Gyrus and a couple of other games. And the thing was, it was encrypted using the two of the address lines on every I think it's the even numbered bits. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that one. The even numbered data bits were actually encrypted, and it was the opcodes that were encrypted. So
wow.
I had to find how to inject the opcodes directly into Greg's implementation, because what MiSTer X had done was exactly that with CPU 09, which is a model that turned out to be actually not quite accurate to the original 6809E. It was actually running faster in certain instances. And thanks to DevSaurus, who's Artem, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, so I'm not even going to try it. His SN76489 is used in Time Pilot 84 with a couple of bug fixes to deal with the noise channel and a couple of off-by-one errors. But he found a bug in the sign extension instruction for Greg's MC6809E, which is actually causing Time Pilot 84 to draw the tile map in the wrong order.
That's so specific.
That one instruction, because it was not handling the flags, all the condition codes, it was producing incorrect results for the tile map layer. But nothing else that I was using that CPU model with exhibited any sort of anomalies. And I eventually figured out a way to directly inject those opcodes into Greg's MC6809E. I was breaking my head with a reverse engineered model of, or not so much a reverse engineered model, but there was a schematic for a bootleg Gyrus board that had a separate board with the MC6809E and some logic to do the opcode decryption. Tried that at first and it would never work. So I decided, okay, let me try something. Let me try this direct opcode injection. Scan through the code, find where I think it would go. By pure luck, I got it first shot.
Wow.
So I've been using that now for the Konami 1, that XOR XNOR encrypted MC6809E, and which is now in jailbreak.
Exactly, and that brings us to you've been working together on some stuff, right?
That's been our...
not really together, but we both were working, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually ended up getting the game going in our own methods practically at the exact same time. Blackwine, though, was confident enough, I guess you could say, to release it as is, but me being the kind of person I am with audio, the fact that the VLM 5030 was not really a thing, I decided to hold it back. Then, speaking to DevSource a bit, he ended up then creating a gate-level model of the VLM 5030 using a decap of the chip, and the end result is better than pretty much any other clone of the chip that I've heard outside of commercial software emulation. It's really in a good spot, and that gives me confidence when I get to the Konami GX400 platform, because Salamander makes use of that chip. And that's one of the two big ones for me, the other one being Gradius, which is on the same platform.
And the bubble memory.
Well, I'm not going to get onto the bubble memory right away. I'm going to start first with the ROM conversions and Nemesis as well, the international release. But from there, it's going to be a progressive build-up with the GX400 platform. I'm going to start with the video board being its own separate model. Try to get the 6 custom chips on there decapped, so that way I can model them directly and follow the schematics along with the original board, because the schematics are... the scan is not a very good quality, so it's a bit hard to read. I'll have to follow that, plus
you
trace
could
out the
also
board.
make a request on Twitter, and we could amplify it so that probably somebody has a manual somewhere that could be rescanned.
Someone's saying my secret plan to get Gradius 3 running is exposed. It's no secret. I've already been vocal about that. We know that Furtek is decapping the chips that are used in the graphics section for Gradius 3 and a couple of other games that run on similar hardware. That one, as much as I resent Gradius 3, I will still work on it. I'm going to leave Gradius 2 to Yatego because someone
it's
had...
a beast of a PCB.
Yeah, he has the board. Someone actually sent it to him for that purpose, and it would be rude of me to take that away from him.
Of course. I love that PCB.
It's really complex, though, just looking at it, that giant stack.
Yeah,
and
it's
dual
huge.
68,000s as well.
Yes, it's a huge beast.
A huge one with custom chips galore on the bottom board.
Yeah, on the same page you have the Namco boards for Philios and Valkyrie Chronicles and that. Sorry. And,
you could even throw in Sega Superscaler boards in the mix as well.
Yeah, and Dragon Spirit.
I'm thinking more Sega X board and Sega Y board, the boards for the likes of Afterburner 2, Thunderblade, Galaxy Force, G-Lock, and Power Drift.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff there.
I love that era. Y board especially, I've got one here. It is so damn big. Another giant 2-board stack with triple 68,000s on it.
Wow, nice.
It's crazy huge and crazy complex for its time.
And we got a question that Sentient 6 Cent is if someone is able to donate something other than cash, what is needed? Are any specific PCBs needed by Ace or Blackwine to move forward?
Well, one for sure would be either Russian Attack, aka Green Beret, or Jailbreak, to properly validate the video timings on that, because right now they're assumed to be the same as Iron Horse and Jackal running on the 005885 custom chip, because Jailbreak and Green Beret run on the 005849, which looks to be fairly closely related.
And I would say that people can donate time and work as well.
Not just the boards, but even just research, oscilloscope captures, logic probe analysis, or anything off of a logic analyzer, really.
Schematic scans,
That
schematic
too.
manual cleanups.
Yep.
Right? Because it's sometimes so low res that if somebody could work out upscaling those and cleaning them up.
Yeah,
that
some
helps.
games, though, there aren't even schematics going around. And I'm going to cite one that I'm working on, but is likely very far from a release because of what looks like a bad dump of one of the sound ROMs, and that is Finalizer Super Transformation.
Wow, I didn't know. I don't know that one.
It's another 005885 based game, but this one actually uses extra functionality in the chip, including an extended 280 by 224 video mode to draw the score display. And that also makes use of the second tile map layer, for which logic was not originally implemented for Iron Horse and Jackal, being as those two don't use that layer. But it also has differences in some IRQ timings. It expects V-blank, weirdly enough, on one of the input ports to the CPU's data bus, at the same time as it's receiving control inputs for the start buttons, the service button, and the coin slots. It's very weird, but the main thing is the sound on that one, because there is a Konami custom chip on that, the SND01, which, as far as I can tell, looks like a customized or potentially just rebadged NEC 8749 microcontroller with an embedded ROM on it. The current dump is from a bootleg board, and by the sounds of it, it looks like it might have been a poorly crafted clone, maybe possibly done by ear, or at least just some very crude attempt at dumping it from the chip, the actual one. And the end result is actually pretty nasty, because everything is off pitch and several sounds are either completely missing or not right at all.
So a decap would be needed then.
Absolutely, absolutely. First to figure out what the chip actually is, and to extract the ROM contents.
Work for Team Europe.
Hopefully. The problem is those boards are crazy expensive. The ones I see, after currency conversion, if I was to get one, we're looking at something like $750 plus. Just to put into context how ridiculous pricing is on boards. And this is actually the big motivation for me to get these games on MiSTer, because to get the authentic experience, it's starting to become prohibitively expensive and inaccessible to many, except the only exception being those either with deep pockets or who are really desperate to get the actual experience.
Or that bought it like 20 years ago.
That too.
Yeah, it's a shame. And are there alternatives to decapping? Sometimes they can glitch them, but it's usually not the case. Shaw mentions if X-ray is an option.
For that, I'm not entirely sure.
I don't think so, Shaw, because
especially
they are multi-layered sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. If your die has multiple layers on it, I don't think the X-ray would actually give a clear indication as to which layer is which. You'd probably get all the layers superimposed directly one on top of one another, and you wouldn't be able to discern anything.
Yeah, you'd need to be really good to work with that.
Yeah. A decap is the better way to do it.
Yeah, sometimes what the Team Europe usually does is decaps and covers the data and then just flashes the protection and can dump them.
Yep. And I think in this case for Finalizer, it's a requirement, because the existing dump is, well, like I said, it's got problems. But the big test, and this would be something that I would suggest if the SND01 is decapped, take that dump and put it on a standard off-the-shelf 8749 microcontroller, or any sort of Intel 8049 based microcontroller. Then run that on the original PCB to make sure that you can actually replace the SND01 with a standard off-the-shelf part.
So basically that it's just a red herring in some way.
You could say that.
Oh, that it's probably just labeled as such to make it obfuscated. That's what I meant.
Yeah, that's what I meant by it being a remarked off-the-shelf part.
Yeah.
Which,
sorry, I didn't get you.
Yeah, so I know some companies did that, but I think Konami were probably one of the few that actually just made their own custom parts and paid no attention to that, except maybe in this one case.
Yeah, and any other stuff that you think that could help you, Blackwine, as well? Because you didn't reply to that.
Oh, that was well described by Ace, but anything can help. Like even recordings, some hi-fi, sound recordings, or of course it's best to have this stuff in hand, but But
Of course.
if you
In case I own something that you are working on, I know he's going to say that I'm sometimes very slow, but I can help with that.
Oh, it's not just you being slow. I forget as well because I got so much I'm working on. So sometimes it gets lost along the way.
In my case, it's cleaning up the space to bring up the board.
Which brings me, now that I think about it, to another core that I've got a rebuild that's almost ready to go. Just need to validate a couple of things with Artemio on this one. The original Time Pilot.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a new model of that working on my end, and I'm going to try to bring that to update the core, bring it closer to the actual timings, and also get the sound more in line with what you would expect from the original board.
Because timings also had some graphical glitches, right?
Yeah, there were a couple of graphical anomalies with the sprite layer, as well as what looked like an overly big, or rather, V blank that was ending too early and showing some garbage graphics that you wouldn't see on the PCB.
Exactly, because that's something I run immediately. I run the PCB and MiSTer side to side on different cabinets, and I noticed that.
Yeah, that's one of the more obvious things you'd see. But the main thing is, and this is going to be a concern with Konami boards that use the AY3-8910. None of their boards use any pull-down resistors, so resistors from the output pins to ground. They're just directly mixed with a resistive adder. So a series resistor audio pin to a single junction where all the audio outputs, the 3 audio channels from the chip, are connected together. And it significantly changes the volume scale by doing that.
And that's something also that's been a point of discussion or the kind of preservation that you'd like. Some developers have preferred to have the perfect digital output, and some others prefer to replicate the original analog circuitry, right?
Yeah, and this is a big debate. I guess you could say in certain aspects, whether you actually want to have a perfect representation, perfect in the sense of what a raw digital representation of the chip would put out. But the other thing to keep in mind as well is that if you really want to have the authentic experience of the board, or of any platform really, you need to also take into account any filtering that gets applied, on be it digital filtering or even analog filtering, because that will alter what you hear coming out of the cabinet speakers. Which also brings me to the point of recreating the experience of the cabinet itself from your TV speakers or your sound system.
Of course.
It's one thing to try to recreate the acoustic characteristics of the cabinet itself and the type of speaker it uses, but you also have to take into account that what goes into the speakers on the cabinet is the final filtered output coming out of the board. So it's not enough to just take the raw analog output, or at least a representation of the raw analog output from the board, or in this case, the implementation on the FPGA, and just run that straight through any sort of adjustable filter that you would select through the MiSTer UI. You would have to first apply the filtering to the core, then have the filtering trying to recreate the audio signature of a full cabinet with its speaker setup on top of that.
Yeah, because for people that might not be into this, when you have the PCB, and one idealized version is take out the amplifier and just grab the digital outputs, and that would be plugged into a digital system. That would end up being analog in the end. You then have the option or preference what it is to have the original PCB connected to a supergun that's transparent or a cabinet, and output that to a hi-fi audio system or your audio system. That would be the filtering that Ace is talking about in the PCB.
Yeah, if you were to just put that straight to your TV, straight to your sound system, you'd get the raw output from the board. But if you're trying to recreate the experience of the entire sound system that's in the cabinet, then you'd have to apply another filter on top of that, which you could do with the selectable filters that you could apply from the MiSTer UI.
Yeah, because when we're talking about arcade speakers, they were usually just a single driver.
Yeah, it's one 12-volt driven amplifier direct to, I guess it'd be usually a 4 or 8 ohm speaker in those cabinets.
Yeah, usually 8, and some cases, high quality stereo ones were 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that changes or shapes the sound. So it's different levels and it's complications. I believe personally, I'm happy with having the raw outputs of the PCB from MiSTer because they were filtered for a reason, right?
Yeah, in some instances, it's mostly due to, I guess you could say, inadequately spec'd parts. I keep going on ragging on the NEC UPC 324G op amp because this is one that Konami used a lot on their boards, and it is very heavily prone to crunch and hiss. A lot of crossover distortion on that.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic in
Yeah, and especially with low-grade amplifiers like that, if you don't have enough filtering, they will distort to a ridiculous degree.
I agree.
Yeah, it's to the point. It was to the point. I actually tried this on the Genesis. Put the sound through an LM324 with very little filtering. It sounded like there was no low-pass filter whatsoever. So the sound was compressed, blown out, and just sounded awful in general.
and that could be an option, right? It could be idealized and improved.
Yeah.
Or preserved as is and the proper sound. And Sentient mentions that we don't have to preserve the hiss. No, of course not.
No, that would be something extra, I guess you could say, because that is, and I think we touched upon this at some other point.
I believe
to recreate some of the more undesirable characteristics of a PCB's or a console's audio setup, being things like distortion, hiss, any sort of clipping because the gain is blown out too much, which is a thing on the Genesis, particularly because of Shadow of the Beast. That game is so unbelievably loud that the majority of hardware revisions will clip it to an insane degree. Getting the best out of the PCBs. Well, I think for that you'd have to actually model the crossover distortion of LM358, LM324 class op amps, which I'm not exactly sure how to go about that, but if you were to look at a waveform, if you were to look up what crossover distortion is, you'd see images of where a sine wave, let's say, was to cross over from a positive peak to the negative. You would see that it would start to flatline when it starts to reach 0. Then it would sharply drop towards the negative peak, come back, and it would do the same thing. So you wouldn't get a proper sine wave, you'd get one that is slightly distorted. And with a lot of high-frequency content, especially with FM synthesis chips, you could potentially get a lot of distortion as a result of that. Audible distortion.
Interesting. Yes, it's... Yeah, Blackwine mentions that in the chat that he'd recommend the Amiga version of Shadow of the Beast. Yeah, that's the original, right?
Yeah.
I think it is.
Yeah, it's got some unique sound to it.
Yeah, the Genesis version is not really that highly regarded.
No, I have some nostalgia for it since I got it after my cousin played it in his Amiga, so...
Actually, fun fact, I never knew this game existed until it was brought up that it was so unbelievably loud, because when I did the Mega Amp and Mega Amp 2.0 in 2014, 2017, first I was trying to get the gain up to about where a standard Genesis would be. Then with the 2.0, tried to put it as high as possible to match the maximum volume of the headphone output of the Model 1. That was not the way to go, because this game produces such loud sound that those two will clip.
I don't know if I told you, but I made a test to try and match this. That's called constructive interference. I believe I didn't release it. But the idea is to play all channels at the same or harmonic frequencies so they can add up. I believe that's what's happening there in Shadow of the Beast.
I'm not sure about that, but whatever the case may be, I think most of the channels, if not the entire YM2612, for whatever reason, is being set to either maximum or close to maximum volume for each channel. And with all of those piling up, you get distortion because you end up overwhelming your audio amplifier.
Yeah, of course. The PC Engine CD version. No, I would recommend stick to the Amiga version.
Yeah,
It's interesting. Cinemas are interesting in the PC Engine CD version, but no.
Well, I haven't played it, so I'm going to refrain from commenting on that.
It's a very hard game anyway, but it's visually very appealing. It's very interesting, and the music is great in the original version.
yeah.
I liked the Genesis rendition, but
yeah, and Shadow of the Beast 3. I remember I played this, and music plays a role in this too because it changes.
Is that an Amiga exclusive? Because I don't think that one got a port to the Genesis. I think Shadow of the Beast 2 did, but the third one I don't recall seeing.
I believe it's exclusive. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it may be exclusive. Yes.
And there's also some games that caught my eye from your list, Blackwine. Phoenix and Playgates.
Phoenix. Yeah, well, it was my early time with doing MiSTer stuff, and it also was that flip screen thing I was doing at the beginning. So yeah, it's nice game. Like all shmups, I love to play them. Also this one.
Any stories from your childhood with it? Or?
Oh, not really that far.
Well, sometime.
I'm
asking because something led you to fix it, right? Or well, to add the dip switch for monitor flipping.
Yeah, but so I was looking at these games, trying to play them, and if it didn't had a flip, I'll look at the code and what I can do with it, and did the thing with a bunch of course. Pango, Donkey Kong games. By the way, Donkey Kong needs some real improvements to the audio. So maybe Ace could help because
it's too harsh.
I think it's using samples.
Yes, it is.
Instead of logic, so it has to be like rebuilt from ground up. The sound part of it.
And it's an interesting case because the amplifier is not in the PCB; it's in the cabinet.
So if any filtering is applied from that, you would lose it if you were to grab straight from the board. But the main thing here, from what I recall, this is one that doesn't use a dedicated sound chip, but is instead using logic gates, timers, and RC filters, maybe even LC filters. I might be wrong on that, but it's all just discrete components all combined into one big circuit to generate sound. But for that, you'd have to do what I said to either verify how those timers are actually working together, what output comes out of them, and be able to recreate something similar with the FPGA. And then the other thing would be to properly get the cutoff frequencies of the filters. With in the case, one example would be to use Sultan's filter from the Genesis core, and I like to use a site known as Micromodeler DSP to get the cutoff frequencies, get the parameters that would generate the desired cutoff frequencies, sometimes with a little bit of an offset down or up, because sometimes it might be too muffled or not muffled enough. So sometimes you'd have to play around a little bit with that.
Moon Patrol is the same way, right? As well.
Moon Patrol, I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Yeah, I believe so.
I know Galaxian for sure uses discrete logic for its audio side.
Also, for video, right? Colors are hard-coded by resistors, if I remember right.
I don't recall the video section of Galaxian off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, but that was something kind of common back in the day.
Yeah, PROMs were definitely the most common from what I saw. Then you would have weighted resistor DACs in order to generate the analog output.
Yeah, but for general purpose, right?
Yeah.
I remember one of these PCBs had the sprite colors hard-coded by resistors. I can't remember which one.
That I haven't personally seen. From what I've come across is mostly, like I said, PROMs connected to weighted resistor DACs or otherwise some sort of palette RAM. Which that was the case with Jackals in particular. Although that one, this is another one of those instances where it's like Konami just went overboard. They actually created a board encased in ceramic with chip on board, glop top, the logic ICs on the board itself, and standard off-the-shelf RAM on the underside. And they would solder that directly to the board.
Wow.
So I ended up actually modeling it in that same manner, because if you want to create a clone of that module, and in fact, if you were to do that, you could theoretically add an extra HDMI output with a scaler to get the video output to a digital display. Just have it raw digital instead of digitizing it, which the original DAC, from what I was able to determine going through the OSSC, the RetroTink 5X, you really don't want to be oversampling the analog output from these, because they tend to have green smearing.
That's terrible when it happens, because when you have a PCB that does that, it feels like it's dirty. I don't know.
But the
strange.
thing is that this seems to be a common occurrence with those custom DAC modules on the on Konami boards, because I see it with Salamander as well. It doesn't use the exact same one, but I think the output is the same: 5 bits per color, buffered through a transistor and sent out the JAMA connector. And the end result does get very blurry if you try to oversample it.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen that happen also within some 12-pin PCBs that don't have a ground in the video connector. It happens a lot when it's not grounded.
Yeah.
It just looks smeared.
Yeah, in this case, I just think it's a poor quality output stage. And it was particularly bad when attempting to use a THS-7314. At the time, I was trying to split the signal between a data path E1 for capture, and I think I was the OSSC at the time, but the end result was such a smeary mess that I ended up trashing the whole thing.
What a shame.
Yeah, it really didn't work out.
And we have one topic, I believe, before we enter the last part of the program. It was talking about current display technology.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think people already know what I think about that, at least with regards to OLED. And I'm not going to say who, but I did get a response of a yawning emoji regarding my paranoia of burn-in. You know who you are. I'm just going to say that. But in general, like OLED, for sure, in terms of raw picture quality, you really can't go wrong with that. But my concern is always the long-term durability. I'm talking about 10 years plus, that sort of thing, because that's generally how long I keep electronics before either replacing them or otherwise repurposing them for something else. With the track record I see, especially with older LG panels, I don't think they would last that long in my hands, especially with the type of content I put on, because I often have lots of static content from a PC, or what I like to do as well with MiSTer is to sometimes just randomly boot an arcade core while I'm working on something, just to have the attract mode going, have a little bit of ambiance, so to speak. In my case, I would gladly take a hit on picture quality for the sake of potentially having a more durable display. Because, okay, you could still get image retention with LCDs, but in general, those displays, provided nothing goes wrong with the electronics or the backlighting, should be more durable. That's the theory anyways. But the other thing too, this is something that I commonly see in AV circles. There is a lot of disdain, I guess you could say, for IPS and IPS style LCDs. So we're talking things like Samsung PLS panels, or now BOE ADS panels, which a lot of 2021 model TVs are using, including some high-end ones. But the thing with those is that the main point of contention is with the contrast. And IPS in general has never really been known to produce very high contrast. The best panel type for that is VA. But the thing with VA is you end up in a situation where you you do have that high contrast, yes, but it comes at the expense of viewing angle. So you'll end up with more instances of color fade, gamma shift, sometimes even clipping highlight details depending on the panel. And most annoyingly to me is a sort of cone of light effect with certain panels. I see this with the Sony X900E in particular. This is a 2017 model display. If I'm focused, say, dead center, I'll see sometimes a gray gradient that goes from the center outwards. But to counter that, there is the CSOT manufactured VA panel that's in my TCL 6 series from 2018. That one doesn't have that cone of light effect. It has a little bit of blooming because of the local dimming on the edges of the screen, but in general, it is able to have more uniform contrast overall. And going back to IPS as well, that is its main selling point. The fact that it is able to maintain much wider viewing angles. You do sometimes get darkening when you move off center. The main point of contention for me with IPS, more so than contrast, is of course image retention, and I have no tolerance for that whatsoever. I have already returned displays because of image retention, or otherwise getting a used display on the cheap, find out it has image retention, toss it aside. God bless your stress levels when you play a game with massive flickering. Yeah, that was the case with my LG UM7300, which mysteriously stopped retaining flicker patterns. I have no explanation for why. All I know is that over time it actually stopped.
And it was no firmware updates over the air or something like that?
No, I did apply firmware updates, but those were not affecting anything.
I see.
Unless perhaps at some point it did change the way the panel was driven. I know that the HDR did change to where it was actually trying to prioritize maintaining specular highlights at the expense of overall picture brightness. Because after applying, I think it was the last update on this TV, HDR got darker overall, but it seems to be more in line with the presentation you'd find on more high-end TVs, except much darker, because this TV is really not able to exceed 300 nits very well.
I see. And, well, I'd like to ask you, what are your immediate next projects, Blackwine?
Oh, well.
If you want to talk about it, of course.
Yeah, well, it's not good to talk too early with some stuff. I surely would like to improve the cars still.
That's
the old
good.
cars, because they still lacking at some points. I would like to finish the Sega System 1 and 2.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There are many games that are buried there that have no ports, right?
Yeah, and nice maps too. That's how actually how it started. With me doing patches to this car, and there is one game remaining to be unlocked, the Shooting Master. But I have to complete some hardware for it because it's a light gun game. And I think there are some problems because of the way it was, the car was done by MiSTer X, because it exclusively uses block RAM. It's nice. It's fast, not unlike the DDR RAM on the MiSTer, but it's limited. I think there are 553 blocks to use, and the Shooting Master is bigger than the rest. Has more uses more ROM space. But it is light gun games, so it will work on CRTs only, I think. I thought how it could be implemented on digital displays, but I had no idea. So maybe the simple solution would be to disable HDMI output on this particular game, and yes, and that's what's next in near future. I surely would love to do some shmups in more far future. But
we're looking for those.
Yeah.
And
no.
could you no, sorry, could you please also after what I interrupt you saying, also tell the audience where can they support you, like Patreon or Coffee as well?
Yeah. I have a Patreon, patreon.com/blackwine, or you can follow me on Twitter. Also, this is where I usually publish, some or announce some updates to the course. Yeah, that's it.
And what about you, Ace?
Well, immediate projects, the main one is actually to get Time Pilot properly rebuilt, have that be put into the main. I'm hoping at some point to be able to revisit Iron Horse and Jackal in order to get the sprite rendering timed properly this time. Fix a couple of the bootleg rendering weirdness that I had with Jackal as well, because right now there's an issue where when the screen is flipped, the score display part of it is actually missing because of the two lines of missing sprite graphics on the bottom side of the screen. The other one is, as I was mentioning, Finalizer Super Transformation. If I can actually get that one going. The game is running, but it sounds like garbage because of the bad dump.
Yes.
So that one's not going to be a thing. I want to revisit Jailbreak to properly get the frequency response down of the audio output, get the video timings right, and also potentially take that code and bring it over to Green Beret, so that way there's a common implementation of the 005849 custom chip that can be interchanged between both games. Following that, I have plans for the Sega System C2 hardware, and I'm going to target Thunder Force AC first, because that's the big one for me. The next one...
Thunder Force is an amazing series.
Yes. The next one, and this one I'm actually going to look to live stream the entire process, Arkanoid Revenge of Doe. Just to complete from Arkanoid to that one. Then I think Arkanoid Returns is on the Taito F3 hardware. I might be wrong on that, but that will be down the line. Not necessarily me, but that I'm hoping at some point that game will be on the hardware. Maybe not. I don't know the complexities of the hardware, so I'm not going to comment on it any further. Then is the big one, which is the Konami GX400 hardware. And as I said, Gradius and Salamander, first two games to get going on that platform. Possibly even the other bubble system to ROM conversions. So we're looking at games like, I think Konami GT is on that as well. Actually, Konami GT does share the same board as Nemesis, except with an extra input board for handling the steering inputs, which I think that's done by a rotary encoder. And Twin B would be another one, because that's a conversion from bubble memory to ROM.
Nice.
But that's really the big one.
Sorry, Blackwine?
Does it use VLM chip?
Yeah, it does use the VLM 5030. Salamander uses it. Every bubble system game uses it, even converted to ROM. Some games will just have it sitting there doing nothing, or otherwise just play back the presented by Konami and count down speech samples from when the bubble memory is warming up, which would mostly be skipped, or actually will be skipped completely on the ROM versions, because there's no need to warm it up. The thing, too, with the ROM versions is that they will actually run a bit faster, because the data is immediately accessed and copied to a bank of RAM that would be used for the bubble memory. So instead of having to read bubble by bubble with the bubble memory, you'd have those slower loads. The loading will be instantaneous or close to it.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. What's interesting, too, what I noticed with Gradius in particular, is that the volume dial is actually of a different resistance. it's 200 ohms on a bubble system board, but on the ROM conversions, it's 1K. And Konami had a habit of putting ceramic capacitors to ground right at the middle pin. So it essentially created a variable low-pass filter. What this would mean is that the filtering would be heavier overall on those ROM conversions than the original bubble system releases.
Interesting. And that's something that could be modeled and placed as an option as well.
Yeah, and I've said it already, and I'm going to reiterate it again. Any fixed low-pass filters, either passive with standard resistor to capacitor to ground, a switch low-pass filter which has a 4066 or similar analog switch in between, or an active filter that's put in the audio circuit and the active components, amplifiers, whatever, those will always be modeled and it will always be active. That is a guarantee and is a non-negotiable. Whatever comes after that, either acoustic characteristics caused by the cabinet and the speaker setup, or any variable filters caused by volume dials which act as variable filters as a result of having capacitors to ground, those would be separate, that you would then load through the MiSTer audio filter options.
Got it. And how can people, where can they follow you and support if available?
For support, I just got a Ko-Fi page opened up, ko-fi.com/ace9921. And it's completely optional. I'm not going to pressure anybody into getting into that, because, and this was the thing with Patreon. To me, it seemed like it would pressure both sides, one side to pay up, the other side to constantly deliver something. I don't want that stress. I just want to do everything at my own pace, have my work out there. If you like it, if you think my work is worth something to you, feel free to donate. Otherwise, just enjoy whatever I release. I'm happy with that.
Nice.
And you can also follow me on Twitter at Ace9921tweets and my YouTube channel Ace9921. I will preview cores with some direct capture whenever they're nearing release.
Thank you very much. And well, I'd like to thank you and the audience for being here and talking about all these projects and all this information. And of course, also thank Sentient Six and Risha for the space and making this possible.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much. Very nice talk. I enjoyed this a lot. I maybe went a bit overboard on technical details, but I mean, hey, that's what we do. We obsess over this stuff.
Yeah. Blackwine tried to keep it back on the technical details. I understand why, but
yeah,
this is the place where it could be mentioned.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much for everything. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I deeply respect your work as with every other guest we've had. It's been a pleasure, and thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great honor for me as well. Thank you.
Hope you have a good night, rest, sleep, Blackwine.
good morning, I think, because it's almost, sun is rising.
Yeah. Thank you for keeping with us at this time for you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.